Can I thank you for the invitation to be here this evening? If you're not aware of my role in this evening's proceedings, my name's Huw Lewis. I'm the Housing, Regeneration and Heritage Minister in Wales, so a member of the Welsh Government. Before I make a few remarks, and I intend to make them as brief as I possibly can, because the discussion is very thought-provoking. And I do wish I'd arrived a little earlier, actually, in order to catch a little more of it. I would like to thank, on behalf of the Welsh Government, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Wizard Research Network, and Dr. Peter Mackey as well, for the very important role in which they're playing in this, of which this evening is a part, the debate surrounding homelessness and where we go from here in Wales. Evidence is going to be a very important part of that, as has been mentioned, and learning from others will be equally as important. I've been in this job about 8 months now, and have spent that time undertaking a crash course in all things connected with housing, and of course that vital element that we need to get right in terms of our homelessness policy as part of that. I've been very impressed and intrigued by trips that I've made, for instance, to Sweden, to take a look at a very sort of mature social democratic model, if you like, of the way that housing provision has worked for quite some time, although the Swedish Tories are busy trying to dismantle it just as we speak. So I may have just seen the end of the glory days in terms of social housing provision in Sweden as I was there. But most particularly Scotland, and that's why the remarks that Suzanne has been making tonight are of enormous interest to me and to us in the Welsh Assembly Government, because to give a little context around this, and judging by some of the comments I've heard this morning, it might be worth clarifying this. Wales is not England. I am not Grant Bloody Shapps. And housing is devolved. Okay? The only element of housing policy and lawmaking that is not devolved to us here in the Welsh Government as we stand at the moment is the consumer laws surrounding the buying and selling of homes in the market. And I regret that that's not within our control, but everything else pretty much is. This is also a fairly new situation. It's only a few months old, because the primary legislative powers that come along with those responsibilities have only just arrived on our doorstep. So although a lot of the policy development has been ours for some time, the legislative powers have relatively newly arrived here in Cardiff. And that's why studying what's happened in Scotland is probably the most important thing in terms of learning from others that I'm interested in at the moment, because there is a devolved administration working in what you might describe as a hostile political environment as regards the UK political environment as a whole, with vast ideological differences between the devolved administration and what's going on down in the UK government, connected with the potential that a devolved administration brings along to that picture. Well, first of all, it's worth making a statement of values within this as well. And I think I would be speaking for most of my colleagues down in the Welsh Assembly if I was to say that our values do differ from Mr. Shapps and the philosophy behind what is driving a lot of the England or UK government housing policies at the moment. We do have a concern primarily for social justice. We do see homelessness and housing policy more widely as an issue of fairness. We do see these as the starting points and the quality of life and what citizens should expect from their citizenship of a civilised society as being the jumping off point for many of these debates. We do also recognise that markets fail, and that they fail real people in real circumstances and cause enormous pain and distress when they do so, and that market-based solutions are not suitable in all circumstances. Having said all that, of course, we have to take account of the circumstances in which we find ourselves and those things that are not fully under our control. This time that we're in, this political period, if you like, has been described by several people in the room tonight as a time of austerity. Don't buy that one. Austerity is a Tory Liberal Democrat coalition government construct that's being shoved down our throats as a nation as the cure for the ills, supposedly my spendthrift party that dragged the entire globe, incidentally, into this economic downturn. The medicine that cures this is austerity. Well, the Welsh Government does not accept that. We're with yourself, sir, in terms of the blindingly obvious logic that what we do in a circumstance like this is invest in the most intelligent way possible to solve the problems that this downturn is throwing at real people, but also to stimulate the economy in order to get our way out of this economic downturn. So we have a Keynesian devolved administration, if you like, with a neoliberal, neo-Thatcherite government in the UK. Interesting. So what happens now? Well, first of all, we make that statement of values. I think that's always worth the breath. But that we also take this further now, beyond rhetoric, into trying to produce some answers in terms of the powers and opportunities that we have in a devolved governmental sense, and deliver difference for people, because that's what they voted for. That's what, in the main, the values of Welsh society have voted for over and over again. The idea that social justice matters, that fairness in housing and in other policy areas is central to the way we would like to conduct ourselves as a civilised community. Within the housing agenda, more broadly, I've been thinking about our priorities under three headings, really, and I'll just briefly run through these because it informs the debate, I think, within Wales on homelessness specifically. And the headings are quality, affordability and supply. Start with the last one first. Supply really is at the heart of a huge amount of our woes and troubles. It's been something that's plaguing our communities and politicians for decades on end. There were great strides being made in Wales, I think, particularly in terms of the supply of social housing, which we were very committed to over the last decade or so. And that now hits the problem that we face in terms of the capital choke-off that the UK government is subjecting us to. Some of my capital budgets will fall by 50% over the next few months. That is a stark reality, something that we have to cope with by thinking differently. One of the ways in which we're trying to cope with this is to think about raising finance in other ways. We're very interested in the Scottish Housing Trust and the Scottish Futures model that's been going on up in Scotland, which is essentially a mechanism for borrowing. We're also very interested in how we can release the assets that we own as a community of Wales, if you like, in terms particularly of land, but also using other assets that government happens to own to release capital to keep the investment moving as much as we possibly can. And there's been some good progress here. Some people in the room may know about the Welsh Housing Partnership, which is releasing capital into a new sort of intermediate rent market, so it's keeping that alive. Our colleagues in the registered social landlords, the housing associations out there, are also committed to continuing in investment, and we will fight for every pound of capital that we can continue to put into our social housing grant and the other means by which we continue to build, to boost supply. We've also announced just recently an empty properties fund. Now, this is a recyclable loan which the Assembly Government has set up to encourage people who own empty properties to bring these things back into use. There are over 20,000 of them in Wales, and we're seeking particularly to incentivise the reuse of, the bringing back into use of these buildings for affordable purposes, most particularly. In terms of quality, we will attempt and we will fight to hold on to the quality agenda despite everything that's going on around us. It is very difficult when you're faced with a cacophony, really, of lobbying, particularly from the house builders, actually, demands that we should lower our sights in terms of the quality of build that people are expected to experience in terms of their housing. That we should lower our sights because times are tough and therefore we can get more units of housing if we drop our ambition in terms of quality. But I think that would be a mistake, and that above all we have to remember that housing is something that has to be fit for purpose and has to last us way beyond this economic downturn that we're in at the moment, and something that is inherited by our children and grandchildren, and not something simply that should be seen as a way of getting ourselves out of this difficulty alone. But the big one is affordability, the third heading that I wanted to mention here as well. We are recognising as a Welsh Government our past efforts have been concentrated pretty heavily upon the supply of social housing as our primary duty, and that will remain. We will continue to push that as the thing of primary importance, but we're also now opening up our policy making and our law making ability as well to take a path which is not dissimilar, I think, to the path that the Scottish Government has been on for some decade or more, in terms of looking at all forms of tenure as places where, in this particular period, most of all, people are going to hit problems of affordability, and people's lives will be pushed into precarious situations because of the economic downturn in particular, and that a number of these people, and we're seeing the figures change already, will ultimately be pushed into a situation of homelessness because of that. There are many, many and complicated routes to homelessness, of course, but affordability matters very much and is very much in our minds. So to deal with that, as I say, we're also thinking about new models, starting to move on a much broader canvas than social housing alone, but looking at how we must reform the private rented sector, for instance, in terms of the contribution that we know it's going to have to make, that this has to be a quality sector that's part of a civilised society, and that standards have to be raised to a basic minimum at least, so that the private rented sector can be a part of the debate here and not the last resort before the very edge of the cliff that it too often has become at the sort of bottom end of the market. And also developing new models, new to the UK really, in terms of the scale and seriousness with which we're approaching this. And the one I'm thinking about there most particularly is cooperative housing, which is a big feature in Scandinavian economies, and actually parts of the USA as well. Historically, cooperative housing has been a solution there. So things are at a very important juncture here in Wales. The very first Welsh housing bill is now being discussed. These are the sort of opening days, if you like, of the first piece of Made in Wales legislation that will put a framework around the housing picture within Wales most generally, and most particularly, I know, of concern to people this evening in terms of what we do about homelessness and all the challenges and complexities that throws up to us. We cannot obviously pass a law to make homelessness illegal. Or maybe I could. Yes, I could. I undoubtedly could. We could do that. But experience, most particularly within Scotland, is teaching us a very great deal here about how we should proceed. Because if Suzanne will forgive me, one of the greatest advantages we have in terms of the homelessness debate here in Wales and how it impacts upon lawmaking is that the Scots have pretty much been there for a decade and more now, and have learned a very great deal by their successes and the mistakes that may have been made coming out of Holyrood in Edinburgh. My dearest ambition in terms of homelessness legislation is that we short-circuit and shamelessly plunder the Scottish legal mentality, or the Scottish political mentality, to find out exactly what the strengths and weaknesses are of what's happened over the last decade within Scotland. There are enormous strengths there, I can see, but also there are worrying things that are thrown up, particularly, I think it was mentioned earlier, the ballooning of temporary accommodation as being a solution to some of the challenges that the legislation, very ambitious legislation, has thrown up. So there's a big debate there to be had within Wales, which I hope everybody here this evening will be a part of, in terms of how we develop a legislative framework that suits us, that is part of our value system, if you like, that does drive, that puts downward pressure on the homelessness figures, but that also takes each step on firm ground, so that perhaps we're looking at a gradualist piece of legislation with a ratcheting effect on partners in this debate, rather than a big bang. The debate and the door is open for comment and discussion on that at the moment, in the run-up to the white paper, which we will produce sometime in May. A big part of that white paper, of course, will concern homelessness specifically, and a large part of that, and something that's consistently coming back already in terms of the conversation that the Welsh Government is having with partners up and down the country, is that we should be much more concerned about prevention of homelessness in the first place. The prevention word comes up in almost every conversation. What that means, I suppose, has to translate into duties. And this is a chance for us to think in a legislative context about who is responsible for what. A colleague at the back mentioned the health services and their intimate connection with the fallout from housing problems that a lot of people face. What is it that we do say to colleagues in the health community about their duties as regards the housing agenda? What do we say anew to local government within Wales about their duties? What duties do we place on ourselves as a Welsh Government? Are there duties that we would like to remake for other actors in the drama, if you like registered social landlords? What do we say about empowering the private sector? I'm not going to be completely an ideologue about this completely. If there are ways in which the private sector can become positive players in this, and there are, then we need to enable that and allow that part of the private sector to grow in a context of government support. So I suppose, in short, what I'm trying to say this evening is this. This is a different place. This is not the UK. The stuff that you read in the Guardian, and, well, if you read the Guardian, I'm just assuming you read it. That's really bad, isn't it?
And the Daily Mail, perhaps.
Assuming people read the Guardian. If you read the Daily Mail,
Okay.
on the other hand, perhaps you better leave now. That's right. Oh, yeah, the Telegraph. A nice gardening supplement, though, in the Telegraph. This is a different place with a different starting point in terms of a political agenda. It is also, as of the last few months, a place where the potential for doing things differently is almost complete. The two flies in the ointment, and they're pretty large, it must be said, is that our capital supply is being choked, or that we don't necessarily have the ability to interfere with the mortgage markets and the difficulties that people who aspire to home ownership might face. The social policy around homelessness, on the other hand, is ours to remake. And we can afford and need to be extremely ambitious in a Welsh context, I think. It is a source of distress to me that after a decade of pushing homelessness figures down within Wales, over a decade, consistently year on year, every year of devolution has produced lower homelessness figures in Wales until last year. And the reasons for that, to my mind, are stark and obvious. The way out of that solution is for us to think smarter than Grant Shapps and his crew. We have to find new ways of provoking investment, new flows of capital. We have to expect new duties of partners within Welsh civic society that can assist us in this. And we need to construct a consensus around a wholly different legislative framework that enables all this to happen and makes clear to everyone what the expectations of Welsh society are. So this next 12-month period in particular will be the most scary of my life, but also potentially the most exciting in terms of the homelessness agenda that we have ever been encountered with in a Welsh context. And I very much hope that everyone will be as full a part of that as they possibly can be. Thank you.